Okay, as you can see, we're on Lesson 8, and if you're with us regularly, you got a workbook, and that's page 42 of our workbook. Lesson 8. Time is flying. We're getting through this quarter already into Lesson 8 of 13 lessons. To give you a little bit of a heads up, the rest of this quarter is going to be very spotty for me. Next Sunday, we'll be gone in a gospel meeting up in Alabama. And then I'll be back for 2 Sundays, I think. And then I'll be making a trip to South Africa. And we'll be gone for about 2.5 weeks in South Africa. And so, and by that time, the quarter will be over and we'll start the next quarter. So just want to kind of give you a heads up of where I'll be and why I won't be here. But good to see everybody this morning. We've got several visitors. If it just feels better in here today, it's because we've got several visitors from Alabama. And I'm not biased at all in that, but good to see everybody here. Talking in this basic Bible doctrine, we make no apologies for any of those words. Certainly not for Bible, not for doctrine, it simply means teaching, but not even for basic, for kind of going back to the basics, back to the beginning. Remember that we're trying to do a couple things in that. Number one is not necessarily trying to reinforce our beliefs. There's a danger in that. Because if you try to go back to the Bible to disprove what you already believe, you're probably going to be able to prove it, whether it's there or not, aren't you? And so we're wanting to re-examine our beliefs. And then if they are in line with the Scriptures, then they'll be reinforced. If they're not in line, then they'll be realigned. And so that's what we're trying to do, is reinforce or really re-examine our beliefs according to the Scriptures. And then hopefully to equip ourselves in maybe sharing some of these things with our friends and neighbors. A lot of times when we get involved in evangelism, or maybe not even what we would call evangelism, just in conversation with our friends and neighbors, it's real easy to get sidetracked. And my advice, I'm no expert by any means, but my advice that when you're talking about these things, keep it basic. Don't get sidetracked into something that's not really the good starting point. I'll give you an illustration of that. Several years ago when I was preaching in the Birmingham area. One of our members came to me and said she was talking to a friend who was Catholic. And she said, "I just can't believe the money they spend on those cathedrals. All the stained glass and all the ornate stuff." She said, "Can you give me some scriptures about that?" And I said, "Well, I maybe could, but is that really the best place to start? Of all that could be talked about, do we really want to start with the misuse of money?" Now, don't misunderstand me. I think there's some misuse of money there. But that's probably not step one of what we want to talk about to someone who's in religious error. And so let's not get sidetracked. A lot of times that's easy to do in these religious conversations. And so studying a quarter like this of basic Bible doctrine maybe is a good reminder. Here's where you want to start. In talking to your religious friends and denominational friends, and even those who aren't religious. This is where we want to start, on these very basic things. There may be 100 things that we would disagree with them on, but there's probably only about 3 or 4 we want to start with. The very basic things about God, about how God wants to be worshiped and served and those kind of things. And so if we get nothing else out of this quarter, hopefully we've gotten that, of where to start the conversation in talking about these very basic things about our belief and the way we ought to be worshiping God. Talking about worship in this lesson, Lesson 8, the idea of worship not by the commandments of men, but by the doctrine of God. Turn with me in Matthew chapter 15. We start with this principle that worship can be in vain. As you're turning to Matthew chapter 15, I want to ask somebody to read 3 verses there in just a minute. But what does the word vain mean? That's a word we use a lot in Bible classes and sermons. But what does it mean in this context? Futile, empty. It's not going to accomplish what you think it's accomplishing, is the idea of empty or futile. And that's the concept of vain here. Now that's a whole concept that's foreign to a lot of people in religion, isn't it? That worship could be vain or empty or futile or not acceptable to God. We kind of live in a culture to where anything goes, doesn't it? Even religiously, anything goes. And the mindset that God's going to accept just anything that we throw at Him seems to be pretty prevalent. Now, let me back up. I don't know that you could find anybody of your religious friends and neighbors who would verbalize that. They're not going to say that. But if pressed, that's really the mentality. That if pressed, why? Why do you worship the way that you worship? Well, let me just ask you, if you were to ask a random friend or neighbor who's religious why they worship, where they worship, or why they worship, how they worship, why do you think what their answer would be? Just speculating. For appearances? Yeah. Oh, their parents did. I'm sorry. Yeah, a lot of times we talked about that. Getting into that prejudice there. This is the way I've always done it with my parents, and they've never stopped to examine whether this is really the way it ought to be.
Most of the time, it's what that church offers them.
Okay.
As far as, just from my experience, it's usually they offer child care, they offer this, the things that they can get from the church is what usually I'm told the reason they go there.
Yeah. And if we just boil that down, this is kind of selfish reasons of what I can get, what it makes me feel.
I was thinking that, but also they just like the preacher, or they like the way that they're entertained there, or, they just like the way the services are conducted. It's, again, it's selfish.
Okay, it appeals to me.
It's uplifting. They have good music. Everything's positive.
Yeah, and a lot of times that's phrased in good phrases. I could just feel God in that building, which was just simply saying it made me feel good. It made me feel uplifted or whatever. And while all of that kind of sounds good a little bit, but it really forgets the whole concept of worship, does it not? Let's start with this principle. The word worship, that's translated in our English translations, anybody know or remember what that word literally means? Honor or homage, that certainly is conveyed in that concept. But it literally means this idea of fall down before, bow down before. And I want us to think just a little bit about that word that's translated worship. It literally means to bow or really to fall down. And we even in our culture, we're not a bowing culture, are we? Like some still some cultures in this world today who bow. But what does it mean? We're not a bowing culture, but we know what it means. What does bowing, if you bow to someone? Respect. Submission. I've got a friend who is from, I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's out close to Hawaii, the Truk Islands, I believe it is. And in his culture, he is the oldest male in his family now. And so when he goes back home, he told me that all of the males in his family have to keep their head below his. And so if he sits down, they have to sit down lower than him. That they have to keep their head lower than him. And that's a sign of submission. Of the idea of being beneath or submissive to that person. That's in that concept of bowing. You think about it even, and maybe we've been trained that way culturally, even though we're not a bowing culture, but just that gesture kind of shows like submission. You know, if I bow in front of you, that just is just kind of a sign of that, isn't it? But now this word that's translated worship doesn't just mean bow. What's one step further than bowing? Just laying down in front of. Laying down on the ground in front of someone's feet. We think of that, we have a word for that, groveling. Prostrating themselves before them. There's that concept. That's the word worship. And let's never forget that concept of worship. And so then that eliminates all of those other things that we talked about, doesn't it? Of, why do I do this? It just makes me feel good. That's really not at play at all. It's this concept of submitting myself to the will of God, of bowing down figuratively and meaningfully before God, and offering Him what He wants. Whether it uplifts me, now it should, don't misunderstand me, but that's not what it's really all about. It's not really about me at all. It's about Him and offering that to Him. Sometimes worship today is kind of like our gifts when we were young, our gifts to maybe your mother. Ever give your mother a baseball mitt for her birthday? Was I the only one? You know, a selfish gift. You know, if for my anniversary, I'm smarter than this, by the way, but if my anniversary, I gave Deidre a gift to the Baseball Hall of Fame, you, just like she, could see right through that, couldn't you? That's not really about her. It's about me. And that's the way worship so much today is, isn't it? It's kind of that, I'm giving something to you that's really all about me. And true worship is bowing down and submitting fully to God. And so this whole concept that worship could be in vain is again kind of a foreign one. Are you there in Matthew chapter 15? Someone read verses 7, 8, and 9.
Hypocrites, Isaiah prophesied correctly about you when he said, "These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men."
Okay? It's not really our intent to get into the details of what the Pharisees were doing that made their worship in vain. It's just the fact that their worship was in vain. That God says, here, you're offering something to me that I'm not going to accept. That was fairly common in Old Testament days, wasn't it? Yes?
They weren't practicing it, being humble and showing humility. And that's what we guilty of as well.
Yeah.
Not being humble.
Yeah. The worship should be just an extension of who we are. It shouldn't be something just foreign to us. Dennis?
They were guilty of checking off the boxes, you know, to observe this holiday or these feasts, and that was it. They were just observing the thing.
Yeah. And boy, there's a lesson for us today in that we can be just as guilty of that, of just checking off, being there at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, being there at Wednesday night at 7, doing those checkbox things rather than this really being an expression of my honor to God, me bowing down before Him. And so worship can be unacceptable. It can accomplish nothing. Remember in the Old Testament, God sometimes saying to the Israelites, just quit. There were times in the prophet Joel and through the prophet Isaiah, he would just simply say, really, I just wish you would quit worshiping me. Because what they were offering, for whatever reason, was not acceptable. And so the first concept I want us to get, and I know we get it, but to be reminded of it, is that worship is not necessarily acceptable to God. It has to be by certain criteria if it's going to be acceptable to God. I can think of 3 criteria. There may be more, and you might think of them. Number 1 is, it obviously must be that which He desires. The very definition of worship is violated if it's not something that He desires. Am I bowing down before Him if I give Him something that I want and He hasn't asked for? I'm not bowing down. I'm pushing God down, and my head is above His. if I'm giving Him something that exalts me or interests me in any level, but it's not what God has offered. So worship must be worship. It must be giving Him what He has desired. It must engage the heart and the mind. It can't be just that going through the motions concept. And there's the danger for us, isn't it? Those of us who are regular attendees at worship services, of letting this just become a going through the motions thing. And let's be honest, I'm not asking for a show of hands. I wouldn't dare do that. But how many times have you lifted up your head from a prayer and thought, I don't have any idea what he just said? Sung the last note of a song and thought, I don't remember any of that. I really wasn't paying attention. The end of a sermon, thought, where did I go? I zoned out there for 30 minutes. And no worship has taken place, just because even though I did all of the things, I checked those boxes off, worship didn't take place. God's not the IRS. You know, the IRS just wants your money, don't they? They don't care if you're happy about it, do they? That's not a requirement for paying your taxes. We want you to really believe in what this government's doing, and we really want you to be happy about it. No, they just want the check, and they're happy about that. God's not the IRS. God doesn't just want the check. God doesn't just want us singing to Him, praying to Him, doing those other acts of worship if they're not motivated by the heart. It's not really worship, is it? The third thing, as we've already said, worship must be, the Scriptures are abound in this testimony, the worship must be a natural extension of our lives. In other words, we can't just live however we want to live Monday through Saturday and then show up and think God's going to be pleased on Sunday. That God should not be surprised to see us. It should be a natural extension of who we are. Illustrate it this way. First place I preached was in South Alabama, and we lived right next to the church building. And I had a pair of coveralls on, and I had a chainsaw, and I'd been cutting some trees down behind our house there, and I was covered with sweat and dirt and sawdust had blown back on me. I was covered up with all of that. And somebody had pulled into the church parking lot and then walked up into our backyard and said, I'm looking for the preacher. And here I am all sweaty, dirty, covered with dirt and sawdust. And I said, you found him. And he said, no. He said, you don't look like any preacher I've ever seen. Now, I took that as a compliment. He said, you don't look like any preacher I've ever seen. He was kind of shocked that that's not what a preacher's supposed to look like. Yeah, I'm supposed to have a suit on, I guess, when I'm out cutting wood. But you see, the point here is a preacher's supposed to look a certain way, we think. Well, a Christian is supposed to look a certain way, not necessarily talking about a suit and tie. You know where I'm going with this application, is that worship should be just a natural extension of our lives. In other words, if you told your friends and coworkers that you were a regular churchgoer, would they go, no? Or would they go, yeah, that makes sense. I can see that in your character, the way I just assumed that you were a Christian. And so worship must be consistent with the rest of our life, not just some compartment of our life, but a natural extension of the rest of our life in order for it to be acceptable. Traditions of men don't please God. There in Matthew chapter 15, again, he says, in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. The doctrine ought to be the commandments of God. More than sincerity is needed. Again, this is something that is completely revolutionary to our religious world today, isn't it? That sincerity, now sincerity is important, but more than sincerity is needed. Somebody can be sincerely wrong. Can you think of a Bible example? Let's narrow it down. Can you think of a New Testament example of somebody who was zealous and sincere but wrong? Apollos, yeah. He was teaching the baptism of John the Baptist. He was eager and he was eloquent in that. But he was wrong. He had to be taught more excellently. Okay, Paul or Saul of Tarsus, the zeal that he had. In fact, he says, I thought within myself I ought to be doing all these things. And so the idea of sincerity is not enough. Now, again, it's not an either or, obviously. But it's also not just that somebody is sincere, somebody's eager, somebody's zealous in all of these things, and that's all that is necessary. That's simply not the case. And so again, let's make sure, though, that we're not looking at this as an either-or situation. You know, let's not ridicule those in the religious world who think that all sincerity and emotion is all you ever think about, and it ought to be by the book. The danger in that is making it just by the book. And we get back to that just checking off the boxes aspect. It's not one or the other. Worship involves all of those. Again, all of this is simply answered by going back to the definition of worship. What is worship? Am I truly bowing down before God if I don't do the things that pleases Him? The things that He's commanded. Am I truly bowing down before God, submitting myself to Him, if my heart and my sincerity and my zeal is not fully in it? No. And so really the definition solves 90% of the problem about how we worship God if we just remind ourselves what worship is. Okay.
I think something that many times my concern is, and our kids have asked us about this before too, is I think a lot of times a fear for us as the church is these people that are in denominations are probably more devoted and more sincere than we are at times. They're just talking all the time. And maybe, we have the truth, but we're maybe not as devoted and sincere to trying to follow that as they are. And we can, so we talk to our kids about we need to be very, sincere and devoted in what we're doing. And we're blessed in that we're being taught the truth.
Mm-hmm.
But, we try to teach them that's not bad people. They just taught the wrong thing. But they're very sincere and devoted to that. They just don't know the truth.
Yeah. And we need to be careful of that pendulum effect. Well, we don't want to be that, and so we're going to go over here, and because they just emphasize sincerity and feeling, then we're going to get as far away from that as we can. That's not the proper reaction to that. We should never really react to what other people do. It should always be, what does the Bible say? I don't care what they're doing. What does the Bible say? But a lot of times we are reactionary. Well, we don't want to look like those people, and so we'll go way over here, and we're just going to emphasize what they don't emphasize, and that is do things by the letter of the law. And we forget the sincerity, the heart part of it. And again, it's not, we've bought into this false dichotomy that it is an either or, and it's not, because it's not worship if it's just sincerity, feeling what I want. That's not bowing down before God. But it's not bowing down before God if I don't have my heart engaged. And the mind is not involved in this. And so let's make sure that we understand again just the root concept of what worship really is. And again, the Apostle Paul is a perfect example of that. He said that he had lived in all good conscience before God. I don't think he's simply talking about after his conversion. I think even before that, he lived in good conscience. Just that his conscience wasn't properly trained. And so we need to make sure, again, that we're constantly vigilant about what we do and how we do those things. And then the workbook tells us that this worship, if it's to be acceptable, it must be in spirit and in truth. And I want to spend some time this morning and then Wednesday night, talking about this concept. And so let's go to John chapter 4. we're all very familiar with this section of Scripture. Somewhat similar to what we talked about in our first hour, the interaction we learn from the interaction between Jesus and the blind man. Here we're looking at the interaction between Jesus and this Samaritan woman. And so I want us to take some time, just look at this story, and again, this morning and Wednesday night, and talk about this concept, because I think there's a lot to learn from this concept of worship in spirit and in truth, and what really is involved in that. Therefore, verse 1 of John chapter 4, when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself did not baptize, but his disciples, he left Judea and parted again to Galilee. But he needed to go through Samaria. I don't have, and I apologize, I should have put a map up in there of Palestine. You remember, we got Judea in the south. That's where Israel is. And where is Jesus going? He's leaving Judea and going to Galilee in the north. One problem with that, what's in between? Samaria. I'll talk just briefly about the Samaritans. The Jews had some racist tendencies. They didn't like the Gentiles, any Gentile. They treated them as dogs. They were an inferior. Anybody else was an inferior race. They had misunderstood God's selection of them in that regard. And the only thing to them worse than a Gentile, another race of people, was somebody who was a mixed race, and that was the Samaritans fit into that category. The Samaritans were kind of the origin of the captivity in the Old Testament, of when some of those Israelites had been left behind. They intermarried with the Canaanites who came in and filled that vacuum and really made up this new race of people, this mixed race of people, the Samaritans. And so in some sense they were looked down upon more than somebody who was of a totally another race, because these were the mixed race people. And so they just really had a great distaste for the Samaritans. In fact, if you were considered a real Orthodox Jew in that day, and if you were traveling from Judea in the south to Galilee in the north, you would cross the Jordan River twice so that you didn't have to go through that dirty territory of the Samaritans. That's how bad it was. Now, not everybody did that, but many of the Jews would do that. They didn't want to even be seen among those dirty Samaritans. And so Jesus had to go through this territory. So he came to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. It was about the 6th hour. And a woman of Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Then the woman of Samaria said to him, this is to reinforce what we said about the racial dislike or disharmony between these groups of people. She says, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman?" Now John, or the Holy Spirit, adds this commentary to that, for the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. They didn't like the Samaritans. They don't have any dealing, no interaction with them. And here he is asking for a drink. Now, let's think a little bit about wells in ancient days, a little bit different than wells in our day. Today, if you have a well, it's going to have some kind of device to bring the water up. In that day and time, whether it was a well or a cistern, you brought the drawing apparatus with you. And so if he's asking her for a drink, that tells us two things. Number one is he doesn't have a way to get the water out of the well. He's relying upon her kindness. But what else is implied if he's going to have to drink water that she draws out of the well? What else is he going to have to do? Drink it out of her cup or bucket or whatever it is. And she's shocked by that a Jew is asking water from you're going to drink water that comes out of my dirty vessel? And so she's shocked by that. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you'd have asked me, and he would have given you living water. So he just dispels that whole kind of idea of racial disharmony and says, I'm asking you for a drink, but if you knew who you were talking to, you'd ask me for a drink. Now, we know more than she did. We have the benefit of hindsight. We know what he's talking about. He's not talking about really water. He's talking about, I am the living water, as he would say in the Gospel of John later. And she says, sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? That's why you asked me for water. You don't have any way to draw water out of this well. And so how are you going to give me this water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and who drank it himself, as well as his sons and his livestock? Now pause there. Our father Jacob. See, the Samaritans laid claim to Jacob or to Israel as well as the Israelites. So there's that blending of them. Now they didn't, as we're going to find out, they didn't worship according to the law of Moses. They couldn't. But they still had laid claim to Jacob, to Israel, and to Abraham. Jesus answered and said to her, verse 13, whoever drinks of this water, the water in the well, will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never thirst. But the water that I give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman said, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. Like many times that she didn't get it, did she? She thought, I want that magic water. Save me the trip coming to the well all the time. Well, obviously, he wasn't talking about that. Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, you've well said, I have no husband. For you've had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. In this you've spoken truly. The woman said to him, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Again, much like the blind man, based upon the evidence that she saw, how could he know this about me unless God had revealed it to him? Now she says, what's interesting about this, I perceive that you are a prophet. Now what's the very next thing that she does in verse 20? She asked a religious question. You're a preacher. Preachers get this all the time. You're a preacher. What about that beast in the book of Revelation? What about what Isaiah said? And Isaiah, people find out you're a preacher, they got some obscure Bible question they want to ask you. And that's what happened here. Sir, I perceive you're a prophet. I got a question for you. I got a religious question. What about worship? Our fathers worshipped on this mountain. They're there at Sychar, the mountains of Ebal and Gerizim. Mount Gerizim is where the Samaritans worship. And you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place to worship. In other words, she's saying which is right. She doesn't phrase it as a question, but she's really asking a question, isn't she? Who's right? We worship here in Mount Gerizim. You Jews say Jerusalem is place. In fact, you Jews not only say Jerusalem's the place, but Jerusalem's the only place. Jesus goes from this and answers, you worship what you do not know. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. So he first just deals with the question, which really wasn't a question, but was a question. He really says, she's saying, who's right, the Samaritans or the Jews? So how does Jesus answer that question? The Jews. Jews are right. That's how God is to be worshiped. We worship what we know. You worship what you don't know. You're not doing it right. So that kind of goes to this whole concept of what we're talking about here, isn't it? That here was some worship that really wasn't worship because they didn't know what they were. They weren't worshiping according to some proper standard. But here's the real point. He takes that question, who's right, the Samaritans or the Jews, when it comes to worship? He answers it, but then he kind of pushes that aside, doesn't it? And he says in verse 23, but the hour is coming, and now is. In other words, it's right here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship Him. Worship in spirit and truth. God is spirit, and those that worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. Now let's talk about this concept of worship in spirit and truth. First of all, he says, and I think this is key to help us understanding this, true worshipers. So much of this text really has bearing upon what we've been talking about in this lesson, isn't it? First of all, he says, you Samaritans are not worshiping right. So it's possible to be worshiping wrong. He reinforces that by saying true worshipers. True worshipers, real worshipers is another way of saying that. I don't know that he's saying true as opposed to false, although he could be, but maybe true in the sense of real worship. Because you can use that word worship. In fact, Jesus even did it that way. Verse 22, you worship what you do not know. That's really using the word worship in quotations, isn't it? Because they weren't really worshiping, were they? Can you worship what you don't know? No. Not really worship. You're not really bowing down to God. And so that word worship can be used kind of in the quotation mark sense. Worship that's not real worship, that's not true worship. So he says true worshipers, those that are really bowing down before God, those who are really worshiping and God is being honored and glorified and revered, that God is accepting. True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such to worship Him. That really, if it comes to the concept of worship, that should be our mantra. That the Father is seeking such to worship Him. God is wanting true worshipers. That should be our motivation, shouldn't it? God is wanting true worshipers. He's desiring our worship, and He's desiring it to be real, to really worship Him in spirit and in truth. That should motivate us. That should motivate us to make sure that we're doing it by the book, doing what He has asked for, because that's really the only way you're really bowing down before Him, but also to make sure that I'm really worshiping. And so every Lord's Day, in the morning when you're getting ready, as you're driving to the building, as you're coming into the building and sitting down, maybe think about that simple statement of our Lord. The Father is seeking such to worship Him. And that's why we're here. And I think we need that constant reminder. You know who needs that reminder more than anybody? Me. Greg and I are thinking about the sermon. And if we've got, did we load our PowerPoint on there right? Did we let the guys up in the booth know about what we were doing? And do we have all that lined up? Did I tell the person the right Bible verse for the Bible reading? And maybe another verse would have been better in that. And do I have all my notes where I need them? And am I going to be ready here? And thinking you got all these other things on our mind. And you're not even worshiping. You're the one delivering the sermon, and you're not even worshiping because you're too busy thinking about the acts of worship and doing all those kind of things. The song leader can fall into that same trap. I'm thinking about the songs that he's picked out. Did I pick out the best song? Maybe I should have led that other song. And I want to make sure I get the tempo on this song because we have a tendency to drag this song. And so that third song I want to sing, I really want to make sure we get that tempo there. And thinking about that act of worship and not really worshiping. And we can all fall into that trap. And so just breathe before worship and stop and say, the Father is seeking such to worship Him. And just remember, that's what we're here for. That it's all about worship. Everywhere I go, I make a simple request. I want to make that request of you here at South Mumby. If you've got something you need to share with me, especially if it's something maybe shocking or troubling, our big news? Would you do me a favor and wait till after services to share it? Help me worship. You know, come right before they get up to start and say, hey, I just want to let you know. And then drop some bombshell. It's hard to worship. Well, you're going, what? What? And let's never forget that and get lost in the mechanics of worship, that no worship really takes place. And so I'm reminded as I come to this building that the Father is seeking such to worship Him. And I want to be a true worshiper. And so Wednesday night, Lord willing, we're going to talk about that phrase and both parts of that, spirit and in truth, and what that means. We've all preached that sermon of what spirit and truth means. I preached that sermon, but I now think maybe it means something a little different than what I used to think, spirit and truth. And we're going to talk about that from a biblical standpoint of what it means, because Jesus said that's true worship. That's what God is seeking. So I want to make sure that's what I'm doing, worshiping Him in spirit and in truth. And Lord willing, we'll look at that Wednesday night. Thank you for your attention.